TikTok source code is the same as Douyin? What percentage?
I can get back to you on the specifics.
Okay, I'd appreciate that. Where was the source code for TikTok developed? Was it developed in China or in the United States?
It's a global collaborative effort, like a lot of
Was it
code for a
developed
lot of
in,
companies.
was it developed in China? Some of it?
Some of it is.
Okay.
Can you tell me right now, can you say with 100% certainty that TikTok does not use the phone's camera to determine whether the content that elicits a pupil dilation should be amplified by the algorithm? Can you tell me that?
We do not collect body, face, or voice data to identify our users.
So, you said today, as you often say, that you live in Singapore. Of what nation are you a citizen?
Singapore.
Are you a citizen of any other nation?
No, Senator.
Have you ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in Singapore. No, I did not.
Do you have a Singaporean passport?
Yes, and I served my military for two and a half years in Singapore.
Do you have any other passports from any other nations?
No, Senator.
First of all, this is not a ban on TikTok. I'm a grandmother of teenagers. I understand the entertainment value, the educational value, the communication value, the business value for some business on this. This is not an attempt to ban TikTok. It's an attempt to make TikTok better. Tic-tac-toe, a winner.
Swallows. If you didn't already know, we're touring.
I truly am in the dumbest timeline, aren't I?
Hey, I'm Elaine. This is Elaine is XYZ, a vlog that's currently about how almost unflinchingly dumb America is being about that little clock app. So all of us here on YouTube are relatively internet-y people, and it's likely we all know what's been going on in America in relation to TikTok. A full year ago, TikTok's CEO, Shou Zi-Chu, appeared before Congress to be essentially talked over by old people for a horrifically long time as he tried to defend the app against a proposed ban or for sale. The two big issues that Congress had with it was, one, the privacy and data security of children. Won't somebody think of the children? And two, whether or not the Chinese Communist Party has any sway over the company. Because TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company, various officials, including former President Trump and now President Biden, have called TikTok a national security threat. Can the Chinese Communist Party manipulate content, feed users propaganda, and can user data be potentially accessed and shared to them? And now, a year later, the House has passed a bill. H.R. 7521, the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act. PAFICA would lead to a nationwide ban of TikTok if the Chinese company does not divest it to somebody else. And it passed in an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote, despite the fact that civil liberties groups have already cautioned about whether or not it is trampling over our First Amendment rights. And the longer these hearings go on, the more the American public just kind of thinks it's stupid. The bill is now going to the Senate, which incidentally last year introduced its own whopper of a bill that it called the Restricting the Emergence of Security Threats That Risk Information and Communications Technology Act. Restrict. It essentially gives the Commerce Secretary, an unelected official position, by the way, the power to identify and restrict any information and communications technology in America as long as a foreign country the U.S. has determined is an adversary has an interest in it. Luckily, it does seem like that bill has stalled a little bit, but we'll see what happens considering there's this new successful anti-TikTok bill now making its way through the entire system. But in general, you can kind of see that on the heels of this semi-legitimate, if technologically illiterate, worry about a social media platform, the government has decided to willingly create something that could become the largest expansion of executive power in the name of national security. This time it didn't even take a terrorist attack. So anyway, I'm obviously not super thrilled about this. I literally just left a country that is extremely restrictive of internet freedom. And I really didn't think America, of all places, would try to match China's energy on this issue. But also, while I was seeping in all of this news, I was getting this really intense sense of historical deja vu. And maybe not in the way that you'd automatically think. You see, I'm seeing some very strong comparisons between this and the last time America went full hog in a bipartisan free-for-all against something that really did require smart and nuanced legislation, but instead got incredible governmental overreach that didn't actually ever solve the problem to begin with. And we are only now, in these last few years, finally walking back to sense from that extremely expensive debacle. Yes, the war on drugs, which lasted for 50-some years and threw us down the path of hosting the largest prison population per capita in the world, and did literally nothing to actually combat drug addiction or drug use. And it only took us the paltry amount of $1 trillion to run all this time. And I found ways that giant waste of time, money, resources, and Americans are kind of hauntingly close to what we're seeing happen now. When Nixon started the war on drugs in 1971, he declared drug abuse to be America's public enemy #1. He began by ostensibly protecting the amount of Vietnam War veterans who were self-medicating after coming home from the Vietnam War, basically trauma he caused. But his rhetoric during the 1972 election, just a year afterwards, made it pretty clear who he was actually after. The war on drugs and its enforcement was heavily targeted towards stoking fears about lawless and lazy criminals living among us. In 2014, Harper's published an interview with Nixon aide John Ehrlichman, where he dropped the bombshell. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. In the 1980s, Reagan adopted the same rhetoric. We were doing battle against the lawless and lazy. And he utilized this idea to completely dismantle most social programs while pouring $21 billion into drug law enforcement. Crime rates, shockingly, did not fall during his presidency. In the present day, in 2017, amidst a whole slew of actions reversing Obama-era policies, Trump completely undid the pivot to Asia and started a trade war with China. The rhetoric of being tough on China had been a pillar of his election platform, and he'd followed it up by imposing nearly $80 billion of tariffs on goods coming from China. Now, to be fair, 2017 was an explosion of activity against everything Obama did. And China definitely was not the only target of the GOP. Other victims of unfavorable policy shifts included national monuments, workers who wanted overtime pay, Cuba, and transgender military recruits. But China seems to have proved to have the most legs. And I think it's because it has two things similar to the issue with drug addiction. One, that there is an actual problem involved, but any attempt to truly solve it would take an incredibly nuanced 100-point plan that the general public would be like, TLDR. And in the meantime, it's really easy to point to a victim, in this case, I guess, social media adult children, and to denote something as the enemy. And so just like the very visible problem of drug addiction got blamed on certain demographics that were seducing our population into depravity and violence, for the very visible problem of declining American manufacturing, the shrinking middle class, wouldn't it be great if we could blame that scary old country in the East that we chose to outsource all our manufacturing to? China, you see, wants to steal what's rightfully yours. It lured our pure and innocent multinational corporations in with the promise of incredibly cheap workers and lax environmental regulations, and then had the gall to take our IP and compete with us on an international level. Now it's dared to create its own much too popular social media app, which is reeling in our pure and innocent children with memes and funny dances, utilizing our Wi-Fi to steal the data from our eyes. Now, the 1960s sounded absolutely insane to live through for a variety of reasons. Legitimate nuclear threats, an actual dramatic rise in crime, a freaking president that was assassinated, and a lot of people were pretty rightfully freaked out by all of that, whether or not Schedule I drugs had anything to do with it. Similarly, this last decade, heck, the last 2 decades, have been absolutely wild. How many times has our economy tanked? Why is it so hard to find enough jobs to pay for how expensive everything has become? How are we in a constant decline of well-being and life expectancy compared to other industrialized nations? And a lot of people are rightfully freaked out about all of that, whether or not China is responsible for any of it. In both these cases, though, the solution is more of a deflection. There's really very little proof that drugs had anything to do with any of the problems that the people in the 1960s were facing down. And there's been consistently very little proof that China's attempts at technological espionage has really, in fact, screwed Americans over. Any more than we've screwed over ourselves. Which brings me to my next comparison. Because both when it comes to addiction and data privacy,
you make me sick.
Leave me alone, please.
Hiding in the shadows. Hiding from who you truly are.
Oh.
You can't escape yourself.
So despite all the media attention on first heroin overdoses and then the crack epidemic that served as the foundation of the war on drugs, the amount of people actually dying from drug overdoses actually remained relatively stable throughout the 1980s. That began to change in the mid-1990s, even as overall illicit drug use in the United States dropped. Turns out the most dangerous drug of all was one that was actually legal and doctor prescribed. 1996 saw the arrival of OxyContin. Between 1999 and 2008, poisoning deaths involving opioid analgesics more than tripled from around 4,000 to 14,800, making drug overdoses the #1 death from injury ahead of motor vehicle accidents. Opioids were linked to a second spike in deaths in the 2010s as people who had been prescribed OxyContin started to find heroin, which was much cheaper to get. Why were people taking and then dying of a prescribed medicine? Because it turns out that Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin, had repeatedly lied on studies it had commissioned about the drug's overall addictiveness, while also steering doctors to prescribe patients to take it. Ironically, nothing we did during all of those years leading up to the opioid crisis actually helped protect us when another drug started showing up on our shores, fentanyl, which also can be prescribed legally. In fact, the only thing that's helped reduce deaths in these last years, because after seeing drastic increases of opioid overdoses across the last decade, the rate of deaths finally fell in 2022, has been public education, Good Samaritan laws that decriminalize the seeking of help, and more widespread distribution of naloxone kits, which essentially blocks the effects of opioids. Also in 2022, the Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma, reached a $6 billion deal with 9 state attorney generals to combat the opioid crisis their drug unexpectedly became a part of. Well, actually, that deal is still going through the Supreme Court right now. Part of the problem with it is it seems to offer the Sackler family unprecedented protections, especially considering it's been calculated that they earned over $10 billion from the sale of these opioids they created. Now, I don't think anything any company does regarding data privacy will ever really kill as many people as Purdue Pharma has. But I really think it's worth taking a look at who's actually leaking our allegedly protected information to just about anyone willing to pay for it. And wouldn't you believe it? American companies seem incredibly good at screwing us over in this respect. In 2022, Google, the parent company to this American-owned platform that we're currently on, agreed to a $491.5 million settlement over allegations that it had been illegally tracking our user locations. And Facebook has had multiple crises relating to user data, going as far back as in 2011 when it settled charges with the FTC over allowing private user information to become public without the user's consent. That landed it a deal where it had to do privacy evaluations every 2 years, which seemed to have been completely useless because it didn't stop a firm like Cambridge Analytica from utilizing Facebook's Open Graph platform to harvest the data of 87 million profiles, which it then used to provide strategic analytics to Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, and we all know how that turned out. The fallout of all of that being revealed had Zuckerberg doing an apology tour all across 2018, and I mean, partially it was also because that year revealed that Facebook had known about this like massive unconsensual data harvesting and had chosen to do nothing about it. And this is just about American tech platforms behaving badly in America, where data laws are pretty hilariously lax. There are countless lawsuits happening in the EU whose GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, laws are much more stringent. In 2021, Amazon was fined $877 million for data breaches and failing to comply with general data processing principles. And going back to Facebook, its Instagram platform was just recently fined $403 million by the Irish government for violating children's privacy protections by making their email addresses and phone numbers publicly available as soon as they upgraded to business or creator accounts. Won't somebody think of the children? So for all of its faults, Big Pharma didn't actually instigate the war on drugs. It was already happening way before it created opioids. There's something really eyebrow-raising now, though, about how the companies who've been the most careless with our data are now telling Congress to look into it with this platform. Like, how ironic would it be if TikTok did get sold to an American company and all that happened was, instead of being extremely careful about our data in order to stay in America, they followed American corporation leads and just started selling it to anyone who would pay money, including the Chinese government. I was listening to this NPR interview with the senator who brought these charges against TikTok, Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, who is leading the push with the Republican Mark Rubio. And he said a very curious thing when the interviewer asked him if he could confirm that TikTok had, in fact, done anything that could be considered a threat. He said, "You don't get 352 votes in the House unless you've got a convincing case." Well, au contraire, Mr. Warner, because let's look at the war on drugs again. We start with the Controlled Substances Act, which combined and expanded the scope of federal drug laws, expanded law enforcement, and ended up criminalizing marijuana, despite the specific commission created to evaluate marijuana abuse reporting that the actual and potential harm of use of the drug is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal law into private behavior. It was passed in 1970 with 341 to 6 votes in the House and 54 to 0 in the Senate. Then comes the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, signed into law by U.S. President Ronald Reagan. That transformed any focus on rehabilitation into a purely punitive system, including for possession of marijuana. And that was passed with 392 votes to 16 in the House and 97 to 2 in the Senate. And then, when the executive seat switched to Democrats in 1992, Bill Clinton came along and elevated the position of drug czar to cabinet level. He then passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which is now seen as a major driver of the incredible spike of mass incarceration that we saw straight afterwards, even as drug use in the United States was already going down. The whole impetus for this TikTok video came from when I was reading Michael Pollan's book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, which a part of details how in the late 1990s, the US drug law was so wacky that you could ostensibly get arrested for growing poppies in your backyard, just so long as officials had a vague reason to suspect you might be growing it to brew a slightly narcotic tea. Poppy seeds and poppy plants, however, were still legal, which led to this bizarre situation in which, while you could buy poppy seeds, any material about how to plant or cultivate them could suddenly land you in gray territory. And that gray territory could mean the difference between, oh, cute, nice flowers, to the government coming to your home, seizing all of your assets, and throwing you into jail. Even though, again, you technically had a legal substance on you. The fear of the latter was so great that in his original article about the weird liminal legal state of poppy seed gardening, published in 1997, Michael Pollan left out any mention of him actually brewing and trying the opium tea himself. Another person who had done so had, in fact, been made homeless by federal officials because he'd published a guide on how to do it. And basically what I got from all of that is that, sure, you could truly have a problem, but if you're solving it nonsensically, you just end up making all of us Americans way less free. Less free in our actions and less free in what we feel like we're able to share. And very many of the steps we take towards this less free world has, in fact, received bipartisan support. Going back to nowadays, the thought of banning a technology solely because of its country of origin did originate in the Trump administration, but boy, has the Biden administration seemed to happily want to codify it into the structure of our nation. Similar to drug concerns, I suppose, we now do, in fact, have incredible concerns about data safety. I mentioned the GDPR in Europe previously, and Europe continues to be much tougher on our own homegrown tech companies than we are. We currently have terrible laws for protecting minors from digital exploitation, for ensuring that our data can't be used by third parties, that we have the right to know what is being recorded about us, and that we have the right to erase it. Nothing about the TikTok ban or any legislation so far that has to do with TikTok addresses this. Like, we've only begun in the last decade to walk back the massive amount of damage the drug war has caused. I don't want to wait 50 years for us to come to our senses with our digital lives. And as a China watching aside, I want us to have sensible digital legislation, because it's also the only hope of China getting to some sort of sensible digital legislation on their side as well. People might find it a little hypocritical for me to be so against digital restriction after living in an area that's basically invented the digital modern walled garden. But, you know, surprise, it's because of that. America actually has a chance to be a beacon in allowing digital freedom while offering digital protection in a way that China won't, by itself, ever bother with, but could evaluate in the future if they actually saw it working for us. And that won't happen if it never works for us because we've become our own walled garden. Well, that's it from me for now. If you sat through this long rant, please do like and subscribe, and see you next time doing whatever it is I happen to be doing. I hope I am still allowed to scroll TikTok at that point in time.